Hey guys, I realized that anyone who wants to set up a brand new board right now is kind of stuck between the 5.3 firmware and the 6.0 tools. All the VESCs come shipped with 5.3 firmware, but all the tools that you can download are 6.0. So I'm going to show you how to do all the setup on 6.0 firmware. And this is now my third attempt at making this video because it's actually not that easy. How to download the firmware. I just made a video 2 days ago. Watch that. That explains how to upgrade to 6.0. It's the exact same process for a new user. So watch that. And you can skip the backup because you have nothing to back up. And once the firmware is installed, we will go through the wizards. So the first thing on the Welcome and Wizards page, you go to Setup Motors FOC, and here it asks you load default parameters. Doesn't matter what you do. I'll do yes just to make sure that everything is wiped on here. This used to be a working board. Of course, I have a backup in case I mess it up. But we select EUC and we go to next. Then we select large outrunner and we override here, and 2 values is what you want to change. So 2000 for sensorless ERPM and 30 for motor pulls. Then next, yes, we are sure. With this big motor, there's not much you can damage. It's the other way around. When you have a tiny motor and you select a big motor, you could potentially damage it, but we don't have to worry about that. All right, battery cells in series. If you have a stock XR battery, you would do 15 and 6 here. I have 20 and a capacity of 5.6 amp hours. And then we don't touch the battery currents. We say next. Yes, I'm sure about my battery. And then here you want to select direct drive. Wheel diameter should be 280, which is 11 inches. And motor poles should be 30. Those values, by the way, are purely for speed calculations. So if you happen to skip them, it won't make a difference in how the board rides, just you get the wrong speeds reported. All right, now make sure that everything is loose. I have some friction here on my mini fenders, but that's okay. Now this we want to uncheck because we only have one motor. All right, and now it goes. So first it measures the resistance and inductance, and this is the flux measurement. And now it's doing the Hall sensors. Okay, that looks good. The green in the bottom right means it's writing to the VESC. So this looks good. Key is it needs to say Hall sensors here. If it doesn't, if it says sensorless or encoder, then there's something wrong with your Hall sensors, or more likely with your Hall sensor wires. These values look good. Now we'll accept that, and then we test if this is going forward or not. This is the front of my board, so if I press forward, this is reversed. Okay, so I will invert it. Press forward again. That looks good. All right, now we can finish. So this is part 1. Now we need to manually adjust several of the values here. So we go to Motor Settings General, And then we go to the General tab. Nothing needs to be changed here. Sensors should say Hall Sensors. Current, this we need to adjust. The wizard always sets these values way too low for a Onewheel, so we want at least 100. This is a Spintent U-Box 100. It can only handle 100 amps, continuous I think. But yeah, so 100 is good for max, and if you have a little Fokker, you can go to 140, even 150 if you want. And then absolute maximum current. This needs to be 50% higher than your motor current max. Then the next needs to be false, 100, 100. And battery current max, my battery can handle, I think it's rated for 70 amps, but 50 is more than enough. And minus 40, a little bit less for regen. We really don't need that much. And then voltage. So here you want 2.7 times the number of cells for cutoff start. That is 54 for my 20S battery. And then we want 2.5 times the number of cells for cutoff end. The filter constant is, we can ignore. Then RPM, wattage, we don't touch. Temperature, we also don't need, well actually here you might see a 15% here if you have the default firmware. Set that to 0, and then I like my MOSFET cutoff start to be around 75 Celsius and the motor temp cutoff start at 80 Celsius. I just don't want to risk damaging the motor. And by the way, there will be tilt back in the balance app if you are within 2 or 3 degrees of that cutoff, so you know that you're approaching the cutoff area. BMS, I don't have a VESC BMS, so I say none. So only if you have a VESC connected over the CAN bus do you want to select this. And then in advanced, we don't need to change anything. And now we go to motor settings, FOC. So here are all the FOC settings. Field of control is what that stands for. So in general, all these are the wizard values. The only thing we want to do is we want to set that to a lower value. We used to always say cut it in half. Now with the new observer in 6.0, the default values are already a little bit lower, so we don't need to cut it in half anymore, but we still like the values to be lower. So I always have good results with 0.75, so I like using that. But 0.8, 0.85 will also work. Then sensorless, we don't need to adjust. Hall sensors. You make sure that sensorless ERPM is 2000 and Hall interpolation is 200 or 250. The default I think is 500. Then the next 3 we can ignore. Filters is something you only need to touch if you have some like Flipski, VESC clone. Some of them don't use face filters and you got to double check that it is not selected. Offsets, just leave that alone for now, but after a few runs you want to change this run calibration at boot to false. Field weakening, you don't need that right away, but if you know you like to go fast and you want to get the maximum speed out of this, you want 30 amps, 65% and 500 here. The 2% remains unchanged. And in advanced, we don't make any changes. That is about it. Additional info, we've already set that in the wizard, so we're good to go. Now we write those settings. And now the next step is the IMU wizard. The IMU wizard is a bit quirky. here is the wizard setup IMU. This is my third time trying to make a video about the IMU calibration, and it just goes nuts every time. So we'll say default. Let's see if I write those defaults. By the way, anything you do in the wizard gets written back to the VESC right away. Anything you do in motor settings and app settings does not get written back until you hit those buttons here on the right. App right, motor right. Let's look at gyroscope calibration. So the gyro offsets looks like they already are pretty stable. You want those values to basically stop changing. If they're wiggling a little bit, that's fine, but if they continuously go down or up, then it's not done. So this we can hit save on. Alright, orientation. Let's try this again. Roll, it insists that it is 7, so we will have to manually fix that later probably. Pitch is 2. That looks a little better. And now yaw offset. So here, key is to lift the tail of your board, not the nose of your board. So, and it doesn't have to be all the way 45 degrees. I find that it locks in already after 20 or 30 degrees. So that is what you want. If the yaw offset is anything other than 90, minus 90, or 0 or 180, then something went wrong. But if I put it down, you can see it's like wiggling around 150, 30, whatnot. But once I lift it above 20 degrees, it locks in on minus 90. If I lift the front, it'll give me plus 90. That also seems good, but I discovered that that will always give me the inverted number. So I want to lift the tail and hit save. Boom. Alright, so that is saved. Now, we could also do the accelerometer calibration, but I will skip that first. Most boards don't need it. So the next thing we do is we load the float package. And there is VESC packages. We go to package store. We hit update archive. We click on float. So float is the package that we want, and we install it. Takes 30 seconds or so over Bluetooth, at least for me. Okay, it says please disconnect and reconnect, so that will ensure that the config page and the UI gets loaded. So disconnect, reconnect. You don't have to power cycle the board or anything. And then you wait a little bit, and then right here, there you see it, float settings pops up. And now we can configure the float package. So this float package, essentially all this stuff here, you can just leave the defaults. You definitely want to look at the last tab. Here, if you have a BMI 160 IMU, which is U-Boxes 175, Little Fokker 3.0, and several other VESCs have the BMI 160 IMU. For those, you want 800 Hertz here. Little Fokker 3.1 is the one that needs 832. I'm not sure why we default to 832. Probably, I'm assuming Nico has a Little Fokker 3.1, and that's why he defaults to it. But for most other VESCs, it is 800. Now, I want high voltage tilt back to be 4.3 volts per cell. That's 86 for me. and I want low voltage tilt back to be 3.0 volts per cell, so for me that's 60. ADC1 and ADC2. So for most sensors, 3 volts will work. This is the minimum that you need. I also have a buzzer. I want that to be on. So I'll hit right. And now it should already be set up. If you want to see what the state is of the Float app, you want to go back to the Welcome and Wizards page. You want to cancel out of any wizard that you may still have open. And then you see the app UI. And in here there is some slightly cryptic info. Fault startup is not really a fault. It just means it's in the initial state. It tells you that the switches are off. But here's the key. Pitch and roll are both near 0. If you have roll somewhere close to 180, that means it thinks your board is upside down, which means your calibration didn't work and you need your IMU flipped. You got to go back to IMU calibration and figure out how to get that flipped. That's what you want to look for. So here I know that if I press these two, it will actually start spinning. And it'll go pretty hard. Okay, actually it's nicely balanced. So once your IMU is calibrated and you see that you get pitch and roll near 0, then the next thing that you need to verify is that your switches engage. And basically if you press down here, you should see your values go up to 3 volts or whatever the threshold is. If it's less than 3 volts, as long as it's consistent, you just change your fault values in the float settings accordingly. And that is about it. So now you're ready to step onto the board. So let's give it a try. Me personally, no matter how much I test on the bench, I always do this test before getting on a board for the first time. You grab your board, grab it like you mean it, don't let it escape in case it's reversed, and then you press down. If you are indoors, if you're on carpet, be ready for burnout, so do it on a floor that you don't mind getting a little rubber onto. All right, it's balancing. So let's try this. All right, seems to work. Ooh. All right, something's not right. Sorry, let me record the screen again so you can see what I'm looking at. So actually it was reacting correctly, but something is missing, and I have a suspicion. Let's look at the IMU, and sure enough, I forgot to set all the other settings that make it behave well for balancing. These are good settings for calibration, but not for balancing. There are several values that I see are wrong here, and I will tell you each one of them, but ideally if you go to Setup IMU and you go to that first option and you select Balance Skateboard, you will get all the values that you need. So if we save that and then go back to IMU, now well, no, not quite. So we have 1 Hertz here, but we want 100 Hertz for the gyro low pass. Here we want a frequency that matches the frequency of the Float app, so 800 for my IMU. and the confidence decay looks good. You want that to be lower, much lower than 1. And Mahoney KP of 2 is good. KI should always be 0. And that is it. That's all we need. So we'll write that again. Okay, now the IMU is actually correctly configured. So hopefully it'll feel a little better. Fuck, this is always scary. And go. All right, whew. Now that feels nice. And so if you give it little jerky pushes, it should feel just right here. Okay, so now it is good, and you can see the IMU values hovering around 0. Okay, so now let's look at the wizard page. No, not the wizard. The wizard page. Cancel out of this. Now we can see the app UI, or you can look at the mobile app. And so here we can see the currents, we can see pitch and roll. The state is running right now, and you can see your foot sensor values, ADC 1 and 2. If I now lift my heel, I see a fault switch half, meaning then I still have my toe on one of the sensors. Here I have my heel on one of the sensors, so that part is working nicely. And yeah, so this is it. There is still a lot of tuning that can be done, but the board is already writable. As you notice, I didn't change anything in the float settings. I just used Nico's defaults. The only thing is you change those settings in specs. So you want to make sure that you have those set to what you need, and you're good to go. You can already give it a try. And I encourage you to give those defaults a try, because a lot of people report problems with some weird settings that they have, and they never tried the defaults. We always will ask you, how does it behave on the defaults? And if you still have the problem there, then it's probably an IMU configuration issue. If your motor makes noise, it's most likely a motor configuration issue. So, this is all I had. Thanks for watching, and good luck setting up your boards. If I press down on one side,